Jordanian identity for Jordanian officialdom is, at one level, anybody who lives in Jordan who has a Jordanian passport. And from that point of view, Jordan puts emphasis on its better record than some of its neighbouring states, like Lebanon, for instance, in terms of assimilating some of those refugees that have come to their country, particularly Palestinian refugees, after the various wars. But I think it's fairly clear that under the surface of the formalities there are very distinct ideas of Jordanian identity. There is, for instance, a big argument about how far back you have to have arrived in Jordan in order to be considered to be Jordanian. Some say pre-47-48, some say pre-1923 and the creation of the state itself. But certainly, if you go back that far, you begin to associate, I think, Jordanian identity with East Bank identity, with people who, certainly for 3 or 4 generations now, have come from the East Bank. And that clearly acts as a glue for some people in the country, tribes, people who are very close to the state, people who serve in the military, and so on. And it also seeks to differentiate them from many of the newer arrivals, particularly Palestinian arrivals, who by implication are not regarded as being full Jordanian or strongly Jordanian, and therefore strongly loyal to the country of Jordan. First of all, you have to ask the question, who is a Palestinian? And the arrival time, I think, is crucial. The Palestinians who've arrived as a result of the 67 war, or since the 67 war, are clearly Palestinian and are much more likely to identify as being Palestinian politically, culturally, and so on. Those who arrived, say, as a result of the conflict between 48 and 49, may be regarded as being Palestinian, but may regard themselves as being much more assimilated into Jordanian society and Jordanian body politic. Those who came before 1948-49, who came voluntarily, who came to join the bureaucracy that was being set up by the British when the new state was created, they're much more likely to identify themselves as being Jordanian, but may well be identified by Jordanians as still being Palestinian. So it very much depends on who is a Palestinian. There's also the question of intermarriage. There is a lot of intermarriage historically between people who came from Palestine and people who certainly came from the towns of the East Bank. Maybe not the rural areas, maybe not the tribal areas, but certainly from towns like Salt and Karak that traditionally looked westwards to towns like Nablus and Hebron in terms of their economic relations, rather than necessarily looking into the Jordanian hinterland. So a lot depends on definition. At the end of the day, though, we don't really know. All we have are the figures that are reproduced, usually because somebody has to come up with a figure and there's no more sort of scientific a basis to any other figure that might be around, or of course those who have vested interests in coming up with certain figures. The norm, I think, is to say 50-50, which is a convenience which allows one to accept Jordan as a place that has very, very significant Jordanian population and a very, very significant Palestinian population. And in a way, that's the point of departure. Neither side is strong enough, neither side is certainly numerous enough to consider seriously supplanting the other. Therefore, there has to be interaction, there has to be accommodation. If you look at the accommodation in the 70s and 80s, it was very much that East Jordanians were part of the state, Palestinians were disproportionately represented in the private sector and amongst the professions. So there was a division of labour almost in terms of economic activity between the two. An accommodation had emerged as a result of a realisation post-Civil War 70-71 that conflict would, at the end of the day, be destructive for both communities. And both communities in the end were successful in charting a way forward whereby they could both coexist with each other in the state of Jordan. I think in reality a relatively small number of Palestinians identified themselves exclusively with Palestine, with the PLO, with Palestinian institutions at the expense of Jordanian institutions. The people who do tend to be the people who are politically active, people who are part of the PLO, have been part of the PLO historically, and certainly expect and aspire to return to Palestine in the event, if an event should transpire, that there is peace on the ground. Many Palestinians would identify themselves as being Palestinian. They would identify themselves as having been the victim of an injustice, a dispersal. They would see themselves perhaps as being part of a Palestinian diaspora. But perhaps, like the Palestinians who are also citizens of the State of Israel, they would regard themselves as being part of something else and of having vested interests in, even an identification with, some of those aspects of Jordan. So they would, I think, have quite an element of ambivalence in the way that they would regard the state of Jordan and other members of society, which would be a reflection of the fact that whether they have sought it or not, they are part of that different society. You have an Iraqi presence which must be something like 15% or more of the existing population, very, very significant. Well, of course, this is not the first influx of Iraqis into Jordan, but it is a very, very significant influx, particularly in terms of numbers and also in terms of being a proportion of the population of the country. And moreover, if you consider that most of those refugees have headed to the greater Amman area, which in many ways was already a bit of a city-state in Jordan, you find that the visibility of Iraqis and the impact of Iraqis has been even greater than it would have been certainly if they'd been distributed more around the country, which was the case with the Palestinian refugees when they came in earlier waves. And of course that cannot but have an effect on society. Certainly it's had an effect in terms of the call which these new arrivals have made on some of the resources of the state. So if you think about things like schools, for instance, which were already oversubscribed, Jordan already has a population bulge, 50% of the population under the age of 20 or so. But it's of course not true that Iraqis have been purely dependent in terms of their profile in the country. The Iraqis that have come tend to be the Iraqis that have got some get up and go, that have got connections outside the country, that have got some capital which they can bring with them. And the longer they have stayed in Jordan, many of them of course intended to move beyond Jordan to go to the west or to Australia or other places like that. But the longer they've stayed in Jordan, the harder they've found it to get entry visas into third countries. So the greater they've started to establish a presence in terms of purchase of real estate, in terms of the construction of housing, and in terms of the creation of businesses. So I think the total effect of the Iraqi presence is a big one. It has certainly exacerbated real estate prices, it's exacerbated inflation levels. It has made the jobs market much more competitive at a time when unemployment was already significant in Jordan. But at the same time, also there have been added services available, a sense of dynamism in the economy to accompany some of the drag which inevitably has existed as well.